Hey guys, today we're going to talk about triangles some more. Last week we talked about how the sum of all the angles has to equal 180 degrees. We also talked about how to classify triangles like acute, right, obtuse, or scalene, isosceles, equilateral. Today we're going to kind of combine all that together and just use some of that information to find some more angle measurements. So we'll go through some examples of this. If you're using the slides, we're going to start with slide number 1. So the first question we have says, one of the acute angles in a right triangle measures 53 degrees. So one angle measures, so the measure of angle, we'll just call it measure of angle A, equals 53 degrees. And we want to find the measure of the other acute angle. So for this we need to think of what information are we given here. It says one of the measures is 53 degrees in a right triangle. So that means we know there's a right angle because it's a right triangle. So we know one angle is a right, and then we'll call this A, we'll call this B, and we know the measure of angle A is 53, so we want to find the measure of angle B. So given that it's a right triangle, we know one of the angles is 90, and we know another one of the angles is 53, so we can use that, 53 plus 90 plus, and we'll call it x if we want, plus x should equal 180. Now you can combine like terms together. You get 143 plus x equals 180. You subtract your 143, 143, and you get your x is equal to 37. And then that's going to be the measure of angle B here, your other acute angle. A really special relationship in right triangles is the two acute angles. They're going to be complementary to one another, because in total you have to add up to 180, and 90 of it is in that right angle. So that means these two have to be 90 as well to add up to 180. So you could also say x plus 53 equals 90, because they're going to have a complementary relationship in a right triangle. That's a good thing to know. Alright, our next question on to slide 2. Slide 2 says, one angle of an isosceles triangle measures 80 degrees. Measure of angle A, we'll say, is 80 degrees. And it says what other angles could be in that isosceles triangle? Choose all that apply. So we need to think of different scenarios here. So the measure of angle A is 80, so let's just say angle A is 80. We are told that it's an isosceles triangle, so that means there's going to be one pair of congruent angles. So there's going to be another angle in here, or a pair of angles that are the same measure. So one possibility is if our angle is 80, we're going to have another angle, and let's just say it looks something like this. We're going to have another angle that's also 80. We'll call that angle B, and then we'll call this C up here. So the measure of angle B could also be 80. So if we look at the answer choices, one of our possible answers should be the 80 degrees. And then if we were to finish this out, well, 80 plus 80, that's 160, plus, we don't know x up here, plus x equals 180, so x would equal 20. So another possible measure could be 20 degrees, because the question is asking what other angles could be in that triangle. So there also could be a 20 degrees in there. And then those are your possibilities. We also have 65 and 50. Now in order to see if any of those work, we need to think of another possibility here. Another possibility would be, so this was like case 1. This is one possibility. We know one measure is 80. That could be one of the congruent angles. Let's say that wasn't one of the congruent angles. Let's say we knew this was 80 degrees, and let's say in the isosceles triangle these two angles were congruent to one another. That's another possibility. So instead of the 80 being the congruent, the 80 is the angle that's just its own measure and not congruent to the others. If we did that, let's call them y, they would have the same measure, so they both would be y. So you would say 80 plus, well, y plus y equals 180. So 80 plus 2y equals 180, which means 2y is 100. So y could be 50. And that's another answer option down there. So the other angles in the triangle, well, in the first case, 80 repeats itself. There's two 80s, and then what's left over would be 20. So the possible angles are those two. But also in case 2, you could have 80 not repeat itself, not be congruent to another angle. So the other two would be congruent because it is isosceles, and it would have to be 50 then. So these are your three possible answer choices here. So for those, you kind of have to think. It's isosceles triangle. This doesn't have to be the congruent angle, but it could be. That's one possibility. There's two cases here. You have to account for both of them. It could be a little tricky for those. I'm going to try a few more. So our next one, slide 3, says, in a right triangle, the measure of one of the acute angles is 18 more than the measure of the other acute angle. What is the measure of each angle in the triangle? So let's say we're going to call it triangle ABC, just so we have notation here. So the measure of angle A, the measure of angle B, and the measure of angle C is what we need. We were told this is a right triangle, so let's just say the right angle is A. Now we have to figure out B and C. So it says the measure of one of the acute angles is 18 more than the measure of the other. So let's just call one of them X for now. If the measure of angle B is X, and we'll just say measure of angle C is 18 more than the measure of angle B, because one of the angles is 18 more, then C would be X plus 18. And now we have the three angles. Two of them are expressions, but we can still put them into an equation. 90 plus X plus 18 equals your 180. And then we can go ahead and say 2x is equal to, or 2x plus 108 is equal to 180. So 2x is going to be equal to 72, which means x equals 36. So when we go back over here, the measure of angle B would be, well, 36 is x. The measure of angle C, well, that would be 36 plus 18, which is 54. So your three angle measurements are 90, 36, and 54. All those, if you add them up, they equal 180 degrees. A little trickier. You have to figure out those expressions there. Try a couple more. So on to another isosceles one. And if the last one gave you a little bit of trouble, you can go ahead and pause and try this one on your own. See if you can figure it out, or figure parts of it out, and then we'll fill in the gaps. So it says an isosceles triangle has an angle that measures 40 degrees. We'll call it A. Measure of angle A measures 40 degrees. What other angles could be in that isosceles triangle? And our options are 10 degrees, 100 degrees, 40 degrees, and 70 degrees. So let's look at the first possibility. Here's our answer possibilities. We're selecting all that apply. First possibility, we know one angle is 40 degrees. Let's say, we also know it's an isosceles triangle, so let's say these two angles, we'll say A and B. Let's say A and B are congruent, because in an isosceles triangle you're going to have one pair of congruent angles. So let's say B is also 40. So therefore you could also have another angle that measures 40. But we want to know what all the other angles could possibly be, what possible measurements could exist in that triangle. So if this is 40 and this is 40, well, they add up to be 80 plus, we don't know it, but plus x should equal 180. So x would be, in this case, x would have to be 100. So we could possibly have the angle measurement of 100. That was like our first possibility, case 1. The other possibility, well, instead of the 40 being congruent, let's say the 40 is not congruent. This is going to be the one angle that is not congruent to any other angle. The pair of congruent angles we'll say are these two. And we'll stick with B and C. Let's say these two are congruent. So we can call them both Y then, because they would have to have the same measurement. And then we would say, well, 40 plus y should equal 180. So 40 plus 2y equals 180, which means 2y is equal to 140. Then you divide by your y, and you should get y is equal to 70. So another possibility is we could have 70s in here as some angle measurements as well. So case 1, the 40 was the congruent pair. Case 2, the 40 was not part of the congruent pair. So we're going to have our final answer of 140 degrees and 70 degrees. All right, our last one's a little bit of a challenge. So if you want to try it on your own, I'll go through how to do it. This one says, in a right triangle, the measure of one of the acute angles is 6 less than twice the other acute angle. What are the measures of each angle in the triangle? So we have triangle, we'll just call it ABC. So we're going to have the measure of each angle. And we know it's a right triangle, so I'll just call A 90. It could be any one of those, but I'll just stick with A. So that means B and C are both the acute angles. And it says the measure of one acute angle is 6 less than twice the other acute angle. Well, let's just call one of them X. We'll call measure of angle B X. Then C needs to be 6 less than twice the other acute. Well, twice the other acute angle is 2x, and 6 less than that is minus 6. So now we have 90 degrees plus, we can add the expressions even though we don't know their measurements yet. We can still add what represents them. Now we have a nice equation, and we can go ahead and combine like terms. 3x, 90 minus 6 is plus an 84, and that equals 180. So 3x, when you minus 84, should equal 96. Then when you divide by 3, you should get x is equal to 32. And then we just need to substitute the measure of angle B. Well, that's 32 degrees. And now 2 times 32 is 64 minus 6. Well, that equals 58. So your angle measurements are right here, 90 degrees, 32, and 58. You can check, those 3 add up to be 180, which means they're the angles of the triangle. And if you take twice the smaller, 32, double it, 64, you take 6 less than that, you get 58. So those would be your 3 angle measurements for this triangle. Let's go ahead and try some of these on your own, and have a nice day, guys.